Buddhism emerged sometime in the 6th to 5th century BCE as a heterodox movement, challenging the Brahmanic status quo in classical India. Although a fellow traveller to heterodox movements such as the Jains in Ajivaka, Buddhism would go on to become immensely important, both in India but also throughout the world. However, to understand the movement fully, we need to examine the life and teachings of its founder. Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha or Awakened One, was a prince from the small kingdom of Shakya in modern-day Nepal. Traditional accounts state that when he was born, it was foretold that he would either become a great conqueror or a great spiritual leader. His father, wanting his son to succeed him as king, kept him inside the palace grounds, removed from the ordinary world and its suffering. Eventually, the king relented in his isolation of the young prince and allowed him to take trips outside the palace, but in doing so, the king orchestrated the young prince wouldn't see anything that would besmirch his understanding of the world. Despite his father's best efforts, he saw by accident each of these trips an old man, a sick man, and a corpse, in order having the sufferings of age, disease, and death revealed to him, and via explanation from his charioteer, he came to understand that this suffering awaited all people. Tradition states that on his 4th trip outside the palace, he saw a wandering ascetic, and on learning that he was seeking release from the suffering of the world, Siddhartha decided that he would dedicate himself to this path, and at the age of 29 abandoned his role as prince, his wife, and his child. Siddhartha at first followed the teachings of the ascetics, but after a time rigorously denying himself food and living in the wilderness, he found himself weaker but no closer to transcending the suffering of the world. It was at this point he embraced the idea of the middle path, a name given to Buddhism as a whole, where he attempted to thread a path somewhere between the asceticism of contemporary traditions, such as the Jains and the Ajivakas, and the pleasure-seeking of the hedonists. Now aged 35, tradition recounts that Siddhartha sat meditating under a Bodhi tree, vowing not to rise until he had discovered the truth. On the 49th day, tradition states that he attained enlightenment, understanding the truth of reality, and from this point on he became the Awakened One, or the Buddha. For the remainder of his life, the Buddha wandered northern India, converting others to his school of thought. Those who became disciples of the Buddha became monks or members of the Sangha, and emulated his mendicant lifestyle. It is during this period that recollections of his sayings were recorded, preserved and written in Pali, a vernacular language derived from Sanskrit, and eventually compiled into a corpus known as the Pali Canon. The nucleus of the Buddhist teachings is surmised in the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is the Buddha's declaration that suffering is an inevitable characteristic of rebirth, here drawing upon the ideas of samsara from earlier Indian religion. This insight draws on the inevitability of suffering, be that age, disease, misfortune, or death, which impacts on all people, an underlying fact of reality. The second noble truth is that suffering is caused by attachment. In this, the Buddha extends his original conception of suffering to include the idea that it is by clinging to the material and sensual pleasures, including youth, beauty, pleasure, health, and wealth, that we empower the suffering which besets our lives. Even the temporary fulfillment of these desires merely invites more suffering in their inevitable absence. For the Buddha, it was these desires which fueled the cycle of samsara. The third noble truth is that suffering can be ended in an act called nibbana in Pali, or more commonly in Sanskrit as nirvana. The term means literally to extinguish, as in the snuffing out of a candle. By systematically eliminating these desires, a person eliminates the impetus for rebirth and ceases the cycle of samsara. The fourth and final noble truth that the Buddha proposed was the Eightfold Path, a series of steps the individual should undertake to end suffering. The Eightfold Path represents the Buddha's blueprint for life and can broadly be divided into three families: ethical conduct, mental discipline, and doctrine. When it comes to ethics, the Buddha preached right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Right speech means not slandering or lying, and in facing a situation without anything good to say, maintaining a serene silence. Right action means abstaining from violence, theft, and cruelty, and is extended in the exhortation of right livelihood, which demands Buddhists to follow professions that don't cause harm or suffering, such as slavers, hunters, or butchers. To achieve nirvana, the Buddha recognized the need for mental discipline, and as such, 3 of the Eightfold Path's requirements were right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Right effort was the energetic will that is required to undertake the Eightfold Path, directed towards the elimination of desire. Right mindfulness is about being aware of the actions and sensations of the body, and the thoughts and desires of the mind, and in this we see the seeds of the meditation traditions which would flourish throughout Buddhism. Right concentration is the requirement to focus the mind, discarding desires at first, and then thoughts to achieve a one-pointed mind. Finally, feelings, including joy and happiness at the discarding of the other baggage, is shrugged off, with the intention of attaining a state of pure awareness and equanimity. The final 2 folds of the Eightfold Path have to do with doctrine, right understanding, and right thoughts. Right understanding demands that the disciple accepts the 4 Noble Truths, and right thoughts is to embody the rest of the path in one's own thinking. One of the most radical positions taken by the Buddha is the concept of no self, sometimes also known as no soul. In this position, the Buddha drills down into the nature of being and asserts that instead of an individual soul, the Atman of the Upanishads, the individual self is nothing more than a collection of the 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, thought, and consciousness. In some of the earliest writings, the Buddha uses the analogy of fire, in that these 5 aggregates burn with the attachment and desire as we long to perceive the self to exist in some transcendent and atomistic form. It is really the illusion of the self which keeps us tied into this circle of samsara. Without the self, the Buddha explains samsara as the transference of a flame between 2 candles. Although there is no direct continuation of the self, there is an onflow of causation, and it is this causation which continues until nirvana is achieved. When it came to speculation beyond the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, the Buddha was critical of too much philosophical pondering. In response to a potential convert who demanded that the Buddha should give him a detailed explanation of the metaphysical realities, the Buddha rebuked him with the parable. There once was a man who'd been wounded by a poisoned arrow, and when his family wanted to find a doctor to help him, the man said no. The mortally wounded man said that before any doctor tried to help him, he wanted to know who had attacked him, what was his caste, and where was he from. He also wanted to know what the other man's height, strength, skin tone, the kind of bow he used, and whether its string was made from hemp, silk, or bamboo. So, as he wondered if the arrow's feathers came from a vulture, peacock, or falcon, and whether the bow was common, curved, or made of oleander, he ended up dying before getting the answer to any of his questions. Here we see that the Buddha is focused primarily on stopping the cycle of samsara and sees these other questions as secondary and really not relevant to the purpose of nirvana. A final point I would linger on is the position of women in the early Buddhist community. The Buddha originally rejected women from the Sangha, but relented after his aunt requested ordination. However, women who were ordained held a position below male monks, and even the most senior woman placed below the most junior man. Some, but not all strains of Buddhism, have denied women the right to enter the Sangha, and others see women as a blockage on the path to male nirvana. However, despite the lower status of Buddhist nuns in early Buddhism, the Buddha himself seemed to preach the idea that women too could attain nirvana in this life, like their male companions, something quite radical in classical Indian thought. In conclusion, the Buddha introduced another heterodox school of thought, which, along with Jainism, Charvaka thought, and Ajivaka thought, challenged the Brahminic norm. Buddhism would go on to become extremely important in classical India, including in the Mayuran Empire, however eventually would die out. However, multiple forms of Buddhism would continue to thrive throughout South and Southeast Asia and also into North and Northeast Asia, and eventually spreading throughout the world as one of the great religions.